Hello and welcome. This is the episode of FemTech for the Gender Data Gap and Startup Ecosystems System Startup Summit. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think this is a really important topic. We are reimagining what FemTech means to be a little bit more than just menstrual health and reproductive health. FemTech should be a part of everything that we are designing, whether it's research out, or whether it's a car, whether it's cardio health. All of it should be thought of from not just the male perspective, but also the female perspective. And I like to use this a little bit of a storyline of an idea, because the startup area, founders are at their most creative, and products are at their most valuable. If we try to affect change from the government level, by the time we get the idea up to something, it's, well, they may be voted out or it doesn't really go through. If we try to do it from the corporate level, it has to be monetized quickly, so nothing can happen fast. If we try to do it from whatever underrepresented minority we might be, although 51% of the human population is not a minority, we've seen how that ends. But if we do it from the startup level, we have the power to affect change on a massive level, because people are listening, because we have those early adopters, we have those first followers. I'd like to welcome our amazing panel of guests today. We have Dr. Mitzi Krockover, who is with Beyond the Paper Gown, an amazing podcast. I will share that link to that in the after notes and in our chat notes today, as well as Golden Seed Angels. We have Dr. Bridget Nwagbara, who is Vidal Healthcare, the co-founder, and this is a cardio health platform that takes a look at the unique pointers of our cardio health. So, because race as well as gender play a fact in our medical health. And Caitlin Monet, who is a medical and scientific data visualization specialist, and the founder of Monet Medical Media. Welcome, ladies. I am happy to have you here today. And I'd love to start off by with Caitlin, because you're the first person I see on my screen. If you can just give me a little bit about what you do, and how that applies to the panel, and also what unique lens you're bringing to the panel today.
Sure. Well, hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. So, this question comes up pretty much every time I have to explain my job. And at this point, I feel like I should hand out t-shirts. And because I do a rather unusual profession, which is biomedical visualization and design. And that really is a job that bridges the gap between the world of science or medicine in general, and as well as art and design and communicating it. And I like to say that we are vectors or teachers or bridges for explaining a complex concept towards a target audience, whether it be a learned specialist one or a lay audience. And that is my passion, and that's what I do on a regular basis. And I guess that's how it applies today, is that we are in some sorts the architects behind some of these FemTech products. And so it is our duty in some sort of way to make sure that whatever we use as data towards creating and designing these products, it does match the needs of the end user, or the people who are going to be benefiting from it, should I say, and is not just a question of women, but all people who present an anatomy that corresponds to specific needs and that need to have something that's specifically tailored to that specific kind of anatomy. So that's how, I would like to think about this discussion today, is how I, as a specialist in my field, how can I also take on board everything we're going to be discussing today and make sure that I apply it in what I do on a regular basis?
And I love the way you said that, presents an anatomy, right? And that's really the way we should be looking at it, is from that level of an anatomical level. Thank you. Dr. Mitzi.
Hi, Cindy. Thanks so much for having me back. This is a great opportunity and a great summit. I am Dr. Mitzi Krockover. I am an internist by training and previous practice. I had the honor of leading the creation of the Iris Cantor UCLA Women's Health Center that became a center of excellence in women's health. And then I went to Humana as vice president of women's health, and then later e-health and preventive health. So that was a great opportunity and perspective. And then about 5 years ago, I was being what we call curbsided, or asked for my medical expertise with respect to some companies that were being founded by women who had their own pain points and couldn't find the solutions in the market. And the light bulb went off for me. And I said, this is the next way that we're going to move the needle in women's health. And so I literally wanted to be invested in these companies and get more involved. So I joined Golden Seeds, which, as you mentioned, is an angel investment organization that is focused on funding women-led companies. So they don't have to be women-founded, but there has to be a woman in the C-suite with significant equity or meaningful equity, I should say. And we have a health sector group that looks at everything from life sciences all the way to consumer health. A number of our members are professionals in a number of these spaces, and we get together to look at these technologies that come to us in application. And I co-lead that. And obviously, my sweet spot is women's health. So it's been a great journey in terms of, again, especially now with respect to seeing women, especially not exclusively, but primarily, really being unhappy with what they see or needing solutions and taking it into their own hands. And they have not only provided incredible innovations, but they've also generated data for the rest of the world to use. So it's a very exciting time.
Thank you very much. And I agree, it is a very exciting time. I just love the different lenses that are coming out. And from a startup level, there's so much possibility happening. And Dr. Nwigbara.
Yeah, good evening, everyone, and nice to meet you. So Dr. Bridget Nwabara. I have up to 15 years work experience in public health. I'm based in Nigeria, so where I started my public health career after medical school, mainly as a researcher, and then proceeded to work extensively in women's health, mainly reproductive health. And then about 4 years ago, I ventured into cardiovascular health, where I had to lead the country's policy reforms to make both system level and health system changes to cardiovascular disease care and treatment in Nigeria. And then just when I realized that there was a lot of gap for women, most of the interventions we have out there are not tailored towards women. So you'll hardly find a medication that will support women through pregnancy or lactation. And so that's one of the things that motivated us to start VIDAL, a preventive healthcare application that helps women to identify their cardiovascular disease risk factors and also manage them.
And I think that's so important. One of the things that I recently found out, and, excuse me, it was a government-funded cardio health initiated research component was or document was talking about how women's cardio health is not being recognized and not really being tracked by the technology, the medical technology that's out there, because majority of the problems are occurring at the microvascular level. So it's not even at the same level as the technology is really built for. So again, it's not just the research side, but it's how that's being applied in the technology that we're actually pushing out. And on that note, I wanted to bring up, this is the most curious question for me, is when was the very first time that you realized or that gender became relevant or something of an issue within your life, your process, and I'd like to take it down to the business level as well. And we'll start with Caitlin.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we can say that as women, we've always noticed this. This is something that is very very present in our daily lives. And I think even as young girls at school or university, you can't help but notice it. And it also depends on the countries we live in. I mean, I'm calling in from Geneva, Switzerland, and even though it's a European country, we're still miles behind when it comes to gender equality, whether it be just at school or in the workforce. And being a woman who's evolved in med tech, this is a male-led environment, and it's true that when you are a young woman sitting in a board trying to discuss strategies over design concepts of products, you are often looked down and put to the side because your voice does not have much of an impact, not only because of your age group, but also because of your gender. You don't have a voice of authority, and this is something I've also noticed in other spheres. I mean, I'm also a local politician, and when I look at my male peers who try to advocate for similar points as I do in a very similar fashion, it just does not fall on our target audience's ears in the same way. And that's just because, things are very deeply ingrained in our cultures on who has the voice of authority, which sex inspires authority and trust. And it doesn't matter what your background is in terms of education or knowledge or experience. It's just, I would say it's a culturally ingrained concept. And in my workspace, I mean, if you want to bring this back to a more entrepreneurial aspect, it has been challenging, especially when you lead your own ventures, to be able to establish authority and trust, especially when you're going towards different kinds of companies, in order to explain that you have the capacity to propose a solution to their needs. I mean, sometimes I've been in a position where I've asked a male collaborator to come on my pitches with me in order to instill this trust within the eyes of my potential clients, simply because I know that they are a better messenger than I am because of that bias, which is a shame. I would rather not have to do that. But sometimes you need to find a small way to segue inside of, like get your foot in the door in order to then slowly but surely build that trust. And I really hope that down the line, that won't be a necessity anymore.
And that's a scary thing, because if you actually have, if you're going out for funding, first of all, for female founders, it's only about 2% is available, and that's dropped over the pandemic globally from about 3 to 4%. But if you bring a male co-founder on board, your funding pool automatically jumps to about 15%. Right. So, and that really changed. And you talk about bringing yourself to the table. It's not about bringing more women to the table. It's about having that table and that seat ergonomically designed for a woman. So we're kind of thinking about things extremely differently, right? And that's what we need to change. Mitzi.
I'm going to use that ergonomically designed. That's perfect. A couple of things. I just want to respond, when you talk about, and Bridget is the expert in this area, but, cardiovascular disease in women, and that it really is more of a microvascular, meaning the smaller vessels versus the larger vessels, which means that we don't come in and present the same way sometimes that a man would, and then it doesn't get recognized. And there was just an article that came out about coronary artery bypass, and that our numbers are still bad in terms of our outcomes, and for all the reasons that I just talked about. But then going to Caitlin's point, we probably don't even have the surgical techniques that are really better for women. So those are the kinds of things as an internist I experienced. The other one that I think, again, there's so many examples, but I'll give you an example of fibromyalgia, which is a debilitating disease for those who experience it, with severe fatigue, joint pain, and a lot of times depression. When I was in medical school, it was in the textbook as empty nest syndrome, because these 40-plus-year-old women, their kids had gone away, they were by themselves. Of course, they were depressed and hurting and all this stuff. Well, it's actually, it goes by another name now, but I had a number of patients say, my doctors don't believe I have this, because there was no seromarkers, there was no, lab evidence of it, but yet it's a real thing. And again, I think that we're seeing now with other issues such as POTS, which is paroxysmal orthostatic tachycardic syndrome, a mouthful, but basically we're seeing that more in long COVID and more women are getting that. And again, there's no biomarkers, it's a clinical syndrome. So all of that to say is that an internist, I see a lot of these patients who there wasn't a diagnosis that that physicians weren't trained for, so there wasn't a treatment. So then, of course, it's all in your head because we feel frustrated. So I just want to make the point that it's a total continuum. And you talk about from the business standpoint, we need more women in research. And because we have had more women in research, then we've, I think, asked these questions and looked at them more, not even in terms of anatomy, but even in tissue culture. Just so folks know, 1993 was the first time the NIH said, we're not funding you unless you have adequate representation of women and underrepresented populations, such as, ethnic minorities, for example. Then, but it wasn't until 2016 that we looked at sex as a biological variable, even in tissue culture, because those cells are different. The way that we respond to inflammation from a gender standpoint. So research, and then going into, and that research feeds the education of our physicians, because again, so if it doesn't get to the physicians or the clinical providers, it doesn't get to the patient. And then the innovations that we've talked about. And then when you get to innovation, Caitlin alluded to the fact about policy, policy decides what we fund, and policy decides what rights we have and how we can get our healthcare, right? And we've seen that, unfortunately, upfront and close in the United States lately. And then finally, we also need those regulators to understand. So many innovators go into at their devices, and they say this is an important issue, and the regulators don't know how debilitating endometriosis is, for example. So they don't put it on the fast track, or they don't put the funding to it. So that's a lengthy answer, but I just wanted to make the point that in all these areas, we need to have adequate representation, because as we know, that's what's going to move the needle. And we also have to have education of everyone about how all those pieces connect.
And even to the point of taking advantage of the research that is out there. So a lot of times the research is being done because it's required by whatever country that you're in. It says you have to do a certain amount, but then they're saying, oh, this is messy, and then eliminating it or extracting it from the research that they're actually publishing. And, a prime example would be COVID vaccines, which is, if you think about it, the largest human trial in history, right? And the data on how it's affecting women is being excluded from the results that we're publishing, and all the data is there. So it's a matter of just capturing it and making sure that it's out there, and
if I can just say, and that it's interpreted correctly, because snippets get put in the media and disinformation, continues, and then people are, act on bad information. So it's also, again, I guess I should add media to this, and social, so including social media as well as, traditional media to this continuum.
And that's it. When 1 out of 10 doctors says that this is really good, well, there were only 10 doctors surveyed. So, right, it's how you actually interpret all of the data, and to really, and it's on us to go a little bit farther into it. Bridget, what is the first time that you really recognized on a business level gender being an issue? When was the first time you went, oh my gosh, I didn't realize the aha version of it?
Yeah, so similar to Mitzi, being a medical doctor and going through medical school, I mean, I would say that it was, a bit surprising for me when I actually started practicing to start observing the gender differences, especially in, like I mentioned, especially around pregnancy, lactation. So a lot of the work being done on women's health was just about in low and middle income countries. It's more around ensuring that there are safe childbirths, making sure that we reduce the number of women who were dying from childbirth. And so having had that practice almost for more than 10 years, and then realizing when I became a mom myself that, wait a minute, my health is actually beyond just having a baby and having a sibling. So there are other dimensions to it. Like, for example, how do you prevent gestational diabetes? So it's almost in the medical curriculum, it's almost like, well, if you have this family predisposition, you might have raised blood sugar, but is it possibly, can it be prevented, So those are the kind of things I started observing. And then moving on to, my aha moment was, when I realized that women couldn't even, a woman who just had the baby and developed and is lactating and has postpartum hypertension, for example. Where I was practicing here in Nigeria, you couldn't tell what medications to use. So the only medication that was available, alpha-methyl-dopa, that comes with a lot of complications. And then there was nifedipine, again with a lot of complications. And then I remember one day when one of my colleagues said, but hold on a minute, what just prevents me from using amlodipine on this woman who is not, is reacting to both? And then we started debating, is it safe, is it not safe? So that was when I realized that women's choices were actually really, really, really narrow, and these are just I'll consider them the basic. And, watching and the space and realizing that there's been a lot of advances in terms of, let's say, a prostate, for example. Even in a low middle income country, you can almost get top notch, almost down to robotic surgery here in Nigeria, but a woman couldn't even get simple, prescriptions that could match her needs. So that was when we started looking at it from an entrepreneurial point of view. Like, okay, could we even just do the basic preventive care? And then when we started, we looked again, and that was when we now realized that there was even another picture. So growing up in Africa, we've never thought about ourselves as minority, you know what I mean? So, but then when you look at the prescriptions for prevention, you're being told Mediterranean diet. And I remember, one of my co-founders, when we first had to adapt our diabetes prevention and DASH diet, that's the dietary approach to stopping hypertension. So one of my co-founders, we had to sit down to match every single possible diet for the DASH, for the Mediterranean diet, to what was similar and available here in Nigeria. So it was a painful process where every team member had to and then that's when we realized that, okay, so there's actually more to this than just the passion we're bringing to it. There are entrepreneurial opportunities. There's more that we can do just to bridge that gap, both gender-wise and also racially, by making sure that we adapt the treatments and preventive care that people get to both the gender as females, and also matching it to the culture and the race where they come from. So that's our journey, basically. Thank you.
And I think so I recently came across an article, somebody had sent it to me out of Australia, that 50 to 75% of women actually realize adverse effects from medication, and that's because the medication isn't actually designed for us. So even though we're doing this microdosing to say, oh, you're a woman, therefore you will have less of it, we're actually having adverse effects because it's not actually designed for us. So I've shared the article in there, but and that's the point, is that we should be looking at all of this from the aspects of, it's not taking what has been designed for a man, universally designed, we like to say, and being able to apply that same thing by making it shorter, right? We talk about the seat belts in cars, and the actual seats not designed to keep women safe, but they test it on this, they have the large male crash test dummy, they have small male crash test dummy, and then they have the even smaller one that they put breasts on. So it's a crash test dummy with breasts on that's made for males and doesn't take account for the pelvis and all that stuff. So as opposed to actually designing something specifically for women, or creating a medicine that is specifically for women, we're just taking a crash test dummy and putting boobs on it. And perhaps it's time to change that, the way we look at it. So interesting article here on it as well. And I guess from that, I'd like to kind of lead into the next part about how do we influence change then? How do we change the narrative? And I want to bring this story back to the idea of, it's not about bringing women to the table, right? Because we've seen what that does. It's really that checkbox change. We talk about it from the startup community and how that funding has dropped. Yet we're watching checks fly all over the place, but not having anybody lead around. So how do we get investors to the table? How do we get product developers to the table to actually influence difference? And I'll tell you a little study that I did. I took 150 startup founders and I asked each one of them to walk me through how their product is used. And it didn't matter it was a female founder or a male founder. And then I said, okay, now please walk me through how a woman would use it. And each one of them had these, oh my gosh, I can just tweak this, or I can just do this, and this would give me so much more money. If I can do that, influence 150 founders with just that one simple question, could you imagine what we can do en masse? So Caitlin, from that perspective then, what do you think we can do to change the dial, to move the narrative into more of a product development, into more of a research component and actionable change?
Okay, I'm going to try my best. I mean, I think that it starts first by trying to bridge the gap with this whole, like, we are a group and we are staying within our group. And like you said, we don't want it to be just closed between women or should I say, like, people who have female genitalia or decide to identify as. I think it's important to open up the discussion to everybody and make sure that nobody feels excluded. And that starts with, well, first of all, education. And I mean, as somebody who creates these materials to educate, I think it's really important to demystify the human body and how it functions, no matter what sex you are. And I think that, I mean, like, a lot of advances are coming, like we're getting a way better mapping of different kinds of genitals when it comes specifically to the clitoris, for instance. Like, this is like this whole revolution in 2005. And it's the same for hormones, it's the same for how different kinds of bodies react. And also, it's not one shoe fits all. I mean, we all are extremely different. I think we also need to educate people on the fact that all bodies are very different. They're also different based on where they are in their life cycle, where they come from, what they've been exposed to in terms of like a cultural environment. And I think by engaging that conversation, demystifying, making it less of a taboo, making it less icky, if I were to use layman terms, it would allow everybody to think about this in a less scary approach. Because when we're afraid of something because we don't understand it, then we try to dismiss it, and then we don't actually consciously try to dig in deeper and try and address it as like a key feature of something we're trying to develop, like a product. So I think that by kind of lifting that veil of the mystery of how female bodies work and their anatomy and the specificities of how they function, and how one's car seat could be more comfortable and better adapted to one body shape rather than another. I mean, that's already going to go a long way. And I think that that's already like where it starts. It's just kind of, educating the broader audience as to, you know, what's at stake right here. It's not scary, it's not icky. We need to talk about it. And you know, we need to think and adapt and make sure that, you know, these voices are heard, that these needs are also, like, you know, taken into consideration, because it has an impact. It has an impact, like you said, economically. I mean, if you design something that works for this large group, which is a 51%, I mean, you're going to have a better like return on investment in that sense. And I think it's really important to also think about it in that way, is to not close it off in a way where you're kind of hindering or asphyxiating the development of your product by really not adjusting it to the person that it's destined to.
And again, you keep coming up with these little phrases that I'm just grabbing on to, right? So the present anatomically and asphyxiating your product if you don't take a look at it from the larger, adding that other 51% into it. So I completely agree. It's not necessarily about just designing for women, but opening up our product design and our research process to include even what we would consider messy, right? So because ultimately that is going to return in threefold, because you're addressing another 51% of the human population, if not larger, because you're opening up to a number of different anatomical, ergonomical, cardiovascular, neurological, like all these different aspects. Mitzi, from your perspective, what can we do?
Sure. Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, you talked about, 80% of medications, I think you were alluding to this, were taken off the market were because of adverse effects in women. And so if they had done the studies, then they wouldn't have had that cost, right? So it's kind of like, think about what happens if you don't. So that's number one. And then obviously all the things that you talked about with research. And this is not going to be a commercial for Apple, but it is a good example. I have been blessed with two daughters, one who does user experience research, which is basically kind of internal, marketing research. So it's not to get people to be customers, but once they are customers, how can they use that product better? So I have learned a great deal from her with respect to that. And also another one who is very tech savvy, who's been in the Apple ecosystem for a long time. And so when she was under 18, I accompanied her to some things. And I will never forget, there was a presentation on the Apple Pencil. And the original one had a cap, if you remember, that was very small. But if you notice, because they pointed this out, there's holes in them, because they thought, well, if God forbid somebody swallows that, they might at least be able to, like a kid, they might be able to, and what I've also appreciated with Apple, again, not the only one that does this, but it's my example, they are very focused on accessibility. So to make a product, and when she's developing a product, it's really to make sure to look at it through the lens of how many people can use it and how can we make this more accessible, whether it's a visual challenge or an audio challenge or, whatever. So that it was my first introduction to kind of product design and thinking about those things. And then, so it makes sense, right? Because then you increase your market. So to make it a win-win for everybody and to encourage them to do so, there is a time when there may be somebody who's just focused on, when we look at entrepreneurs, we want to make sure that they're not too expansive, right? So if they're in a niche that's important, that's okay, but own that, right? And tell us why. And then finally, one of the reasons, again, that I've experienced in Golden Seeds is that just by, organizations that apply to us that may not have the criteria with respect to the diversity of their leadership, just by a lot of times asking the question, it raises awareness. And we've actually had companies that went and got more leadership so that they could come back to be eligible for funding. And obviously we all want to make sure it's not cosmetic, but a lot of times it was just an increased awareness and a realization that not only us, but other funders in this space are looking at diversity. Because one other point, certainly with women led companies, there's data that shows that they're more successful, that they get more revenue over time. We also know that diverse companies are more innovative, and this is all in data, and I can give the quotes if you want, that they're more innovative, they understand the accessibility issues, and then they also end up being much more successful. So as an investor, that's what I want to see.
And I think that's going to be really important. And I'm going to come back to what metrics we should be looking at and put in place, right? Because ultimately, through all of this, if you can tell a company that they can make more money, that's going to please them. So if we actually introduce processes into place that will see them be more valued or see more value, I think the decision becomes a little bit easier. Bridget, from your standpoint, what do you think needs to change in order for this? What do you think needs to happen in order for this change to happen faster?
Thank you, Cindy. So from my standpoint, and also taking it from what Mrs. said, from the work they've done in Golden Seeds, I think the hats are there. Being that there are 51% of us. But then what we need to change is making sure that we have the voices and then the hands. So as women, you will realize that nothing really comes easy. I wish it was not so, but we've always had to galvanize a lot of voices and then probably work more harder to hold hands together to actually move the needle in anything that concerns women's health. So making sure that within the startup leadership, there are tools to guide them to be gender bias free, for example. I remember when I started my public health career in research, there used to be this framework that used to guide us. It was called the bias free framework. So somehow when you have to tick those boxes, I mean, you'll find out that it's not just being cosmetic, but you're looking at it and you're realizing that if you're doing a systematic review, for example, you have to make sure that the studies that you have found eligible contain the various dimensions of diversity that one will expect to make a good study, like the socioeconomic status, gender. So just having that checklist made a lot of difference in the work that we did at that time. So this was about 15 years ago. So moving forward, I think that's something that we need to incorporate into the startup culture. So in terms of team formation, in terms of the processes, product design, and also in fundraising, we have to, agree that some of these advances that we're asking for may not yield the metrics that the startup culture wants to see, especially at the beginning. So it's something that we have to, own up to and actually take leadership in accepting that fact. And I think that there's progress, like for example, there's Golden Seeds. Then I think there's another startup incubator, 51 Labs, that's also coming up. So these are, ecosystems that are focused on women. So I guess as the space, if that space could get wider, then you have more, not just the hats, but you have more hands and voices to actually make that change we desire. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We need more hands and we need more voices in the game. And I'd almost suggest that it's not about bringing more people to the table. It's about changing how we come to the table. So one of the issues is, and I've shared this article here by Jacqueline Kennedy, is that as women, we're actually asked different questions. We're approached very differently. And that's regardless of whether it's a male investor or a female investor. we're asked preventative questions. And I just attended an event and I heard it, and everybody knows about it, and it's International Women's Day, and I still hear the questions, and it's that preventative. Well, it's such a saturated market. How are you ever going to compete? Right? As opposed to a male-founded company where we hear, wow, that's really innovative. How are you doing things differently? So you see that it's this exact same question, but it's posed differently. So as opposed to going around and trying to change all of this, perhaps we just take a look at how we should be navigating it differently. In terms of this type of thing, we should be training women to come back with a promotional response. And we like to call it that used car salesman vigor, right? Because even from a female perspective, because we're so used to being shy and not telling everybody how awesome we are, we need to push them to be a lot more, and push ourselves to be a lot more outgoing. So turning that into, oh, are you asking about my go-to-market strategy? If they're truly interested, they'll say, yes, of course I am. So we're just changing the narrative from our perspective and not expecting the world to change for us. We should be navigating it through differently. And to that point, women actually navigate the startup ecosystem or that early funding process for a minute. They bootstrap for a minimum of 3 years. Nobody talks about that, right? But here's the other catch. Majority of companies, regardless of who the founder is, they bootstrap for a minimum of 2 years, right? The unicorn stories that we hear about, they're really mythical creatures. They don't happen very often, but we love the stories, right? So that's where we need to start changing things. On that regard, then, moving forward with what we've said, what type of metrics do we need to put in place? What type of calculations should be at the table? How should we be checking off what we're doing to make this change? What type of metrics, ROIs, those type of things should we be putting in place? Caitlin, let's bring you into the discussion for that.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is nothing innovative, but I mean, obviously, the fact that in the workplace there are so many differences when it comes just to maternity leave, and I was reminded of that when you were discussing Bridget, being a mom and how that has an impact. And I mean, in Switzerland, the parental leave between fathers and mothers is drastically different. It's 2 days versus 4 months. It's crazy, and we can see the impact it has on society and on an economic level. And when you look at Scandinavian countries where parental leave is equal between both parents, it has a very positive return when it comes to investment and happiness within the workspace, and also when it comes to performance. And I think that we really need to try to consider creating equal or equitable opportunities for men and women in the workspace, so that one sex isn't let down versus another based on like their biological, physiological condition. And so I think it starts with that, because I mean, as we've said, and as Mitzi has mentioned, many studies have demonstrated that mixed, should I say diverse teams perform better. And a performing team is definitely going to be a team that's going to have a better long-term serenity. I mean, you have better employee retention, productivity, and innovation that comes out of teams who have, various peoples and various kinds of groups. And so in order to favor that, you need to make sure that one group isn't going to be disfavored over another based on the fact that, one's going to probably want to have children and going to be away from maternity leave, or that this person, who's menstruating every month is probably going to be taking 1 day off because it's just extremely painful to sit through another meeting. So it happens. And I think it's important to accommodate this in order to make sure that everybody gets to have the opportunity to be around and to participate. So I think this would be one thing to talk about, is the compensation changes when it comes to, parental leave, etc. And then another is basically like how that impacts like that return on investment. So you're allowing all genders to be around in order to participate in this dynamic team. And then when it comes to key results and objectives, I mean, something that companies could look into is making sure also that there's better representation, because representation allows us to younger generations to look up and change their mindset and to see things in a different light. And it starts with somebody to allow them to identify with, and having more women on boards and panels or in positions of decision making allows men and women of younger generations to normalize that. And slowly but surely, hopefully, it will no longer be a thing where, it will no longer be the norm where there is this segregation between men and women in the workspace.
And I'm glad you brought it down to the point of the board, right? And I think that is an extremely important point, is that if you don't have that voice or that representation as an advisor on the board, on your C-level team, on your management team, then how do you expect to design or do the research for that person? You don't want to do, or that individual. So you don't want to design in a silo. You don't want to build a company in a silo. You don't want to think in a silo, because that's not where creativity happens at the most. So in terms of creating an ROI out of something like that, then I would suggest maybe as opposed to having, a certain percentage of your board that looks like this, making sure that you can draw and be accountable for how that person actually aligns with your go-to-market strategy, your product development, and your research, and being able to showcase that to investors.
Yes, having somebody who validates and who will follow you in your desire to push for that. And I think it's really important. Absolutely.
Thank you. And Mitzi, what type of OKRs should we be we're looking at, or ROIs or metrics?
I don't know that I have the specifics, but I do have, to the points that you all are making about the board, there are a couple of programs, if you will, that I'm aware of. One is that was created by the Black Women's Health Imperative, which is a national nonprofit. I have the honor of sitting on their board. And they have developed what's called the Fair Work Initiative. And to Caitlin's point, the bottom line is that the workplace needs to be fair, whether it's compensation, whether it's access to services, whether, all of the different metrics. So what they have developed is a set of metrics, very extensive, that they will go into a company and really kind of look under the hood and then report back to the leadership. And then they also will make suggestions. And part of that was, certainly there's a huge wage gap between men and women. There's an even bigger wage gap between women of color and women and men. So, and there, during the pandemic, I don't know if you saw the article, but it talked about the fact that a lot of Black women after the lockdown did not want to go back to work because they were in a stress-free environment in their own homes, and realized just became more obvious how many microaggressions were occurring in the workplace. So part of that was also, again, to address that. There's also another program that was started by, or that was created by Dr. Pardes Mahdavi, who was at ASU at the time, called the JEDI program, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Innovation. I'm sorry, and what's the I? All right, I'm blanking, but in any case, inclusion. Thank you. I've got innovation on my mind, as well as inclusion. In any case, and it's very similar in terms of looking, again, under the hood. But the point of that program is also that it starts in the C-suite and goes down. So you have to really, clean up your act on the board level and the C-suite as well, because again, the CEO reports to the board. If they don't have an evaluation that includes some of these metrics, then it's not going to get done and it's not going to trickle down. And the final point I want to make is that we have a real tension between the carrot and the stick. If you remember, California mandated that public boards had to have women. And then that got pushed back. I don't know exactly where that legislation is. And then there's also the carrot that you'll do better. We have the data, but that hasn't seemed to really move the needle. It's like you've got the facts, and we're not, for whatever reason, able to incorporate that. Also on that layer is the tension between our policy and politics about, now there's a, relooking at affirmative action, for example, relooking at women's health, and different rights, as well as then this corporate tension of wanting to do better and wanting to retain their own employees, as well as hire great employees. So there's that tension. So you've got a lot of these DEI programs, as well as what Caitlin was alluding to in terms of policies that have to family medical leave. At least you guys have family medical leave. We don't have that ubiquitously, right? Caretaking, that which always falls to the women, or not always, but primarily, as well as we're finding out that, again, the more women over 50 are in the workforce than ever before, and that's growing to almost over a quarter, and they're experiencing menopause and chronic conditions and all of that. And now there's talk about, certain policies and menstrual policies that you can take a couple of days if you're having challenges. All of that is potential, but then there's this force that's saying, that's not fair, or that's not what we want to support. So it's, I'm not sure I gave you more solutions than I did challenges, but I think it's important to think about those.
And I think that it's really interesting to open it up to the fact that it's not about putting a square peg into a round hole, right? And that seems to be what a lot of our metrics are based on, is this is the standard, the universal standard, which is innately male, right? And we're trying to fit this other option into it, right? And it's not about doing it that way. Again, it's about teaching or presenting everything in a very different, navigating things differently.
Sure.
And
can I just add one thing really quickly?
Yeah,
I apologize for interrupting and taking more time, but I just wanted to give an example. When I was at UCLA, and we had a very young faculty, and one of us seemed to be always pregnant at some time. And so we developed a way to cover for each other in what we hoped was a seamless manner, and be able to have people, take maternity leave or when they came back. And okay, full disclosure, we didn't always, get it okayed by the, in a formal way, but it worked. And we had communication with our patients, and we didn't really have a lot of, from what I remember, pushback from it. But there are, to your point, creative ways to work within a certain situation, that if employees or teams are able to do that, they may come up with some creative ideas.
And it's about the adaptability. And I think that that's the most important component to it. My daughters are athletes. They navigate athleticism very differently than their male counterparts, because our ligaments are very differently, especially during menstruation. I'll share that those articles with you as well. And Bridget, from your standpoint, what checks and balances, what adaptability measurements should we put in place to encourage change?
Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, so I think one of the things that we can change is how we measure. So when we use the words metrics, we're tending towards numbers. That's facts and figures. But then recently, I've started paying more attention to the qualitative stuff. So for example, like Missy mentioned, and like Caitlin mentioned, just looking at the interactions that happen at the workplace between males and females. A woman's reproductive cycle is quite complex. A woman may likely take maternity leave where it's available, and then also take breaks due to menstruation and all of that. But then what does success mean at the end of the day? Is it just about being available at work, or is it what she brings to the table? So this is something that recently, we have started pushing for. So because the statistics is there that more diverse teams are more productive, yield better return on investment. But the reason is just those things that we can't measure. So those soft things, we should stop calling them soft and probably pay more attention to that. So a leadership style, less microaggressions, unfortunately, for example, you cannot measure them, but they do have a lot of impact on how productivity And unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence that women are on the receiving end of most of the microaggressions. Like, we started by saying that even a startup pitch session between males and females have been asked questions in different ways. So those are the kind of things. So we should pay more attention to those soft things, or rather the core things, like how much happiness does this female bring to the table. So how, like, for example, in terms of at the beginning, how many users are they able to bring and how are they doing it? So just like, instead of saying, oh, how many users, but looking subtly at where are these users? Are they the kind of users that could be sustained over time? Are they meeting the needs of the people such that people would like it better? So I mean, there's a culture going on right now in the Nigerian startup ecosystem where you see adverts by startups being downloaded, simply download it. So when we look at it and we're like, no, this is not. So you download it and then what? But that's because most startups are all focused on fundraising and they want to show traction. So, so those kind of, so changing those metrics is to, more, things that are more core and more valuable, more quality, rather than just the hard numbers.
And I think that's a powerful statement. I mean, attaching these metrics to growth, right? These growth metrics at the very earliest stage when they really matter, and being able to put, your money where your mouth is, so to speak, on these effective changes. All of a sudden, when you're doing that pitch and you're saying, my product, my research is accessible, is all encompassing, we have done it, or we're working towards that, the same as we're doing with environmental and sustainability and circularity, which should be built into all products as well. Perhaps maybe we take a look at what the environmental movement is doing, because they've got something right, and they are changing habits and they are making us take notice from the very earliest level. We are getting close to the end, and I'd like to thank you all. I do have one question that I think is extremely important. I'd like to know how each one of you are going to leave this panel today with, or first of all, what really kind of went, oh, didn't think of it that way, and how you'll be able to take that back into your lives to create actionable change rather than checkbox change. And Caitlin, we'll start with you.
Sure, I'll try and be quick then. I guess that what I really take home from this talk today is the need to continue to advocate and to not be afraid to, stand by your opinion and your thoughts, and also the importance that this has in terms of design and construction of different kinds of products. And I've always had that in mind. I've always tried to advocate, whether it be for a specific gender or sex issue, or even an ethnic or cultural approach. But I really see the importance of not backing down when you're told no, because it's not convenient. So within the limits of what is possible, that is something that I really want to continue to advocate for.
Thank you. And Mitzi.
So many things from these ladies, and you, Cindy. So I can't wait to look at the recording and actually quote some of these, the ergonomics issue, the anatomical focus, as well as what Bridget just talked about in terms of these soft metrics really being, we need to find a different word for it, right? And I think that, again, it's just really important for me to continue what I'm doing in terms of, and being non-apologetic with respect to, I think what Caitlin just said, in demanding, if you will, or assuming or expecting diversity in leadership, as well as, gender diversity and all other ways. And making that a metric for what I invest in, what we bring to light, and certainly with women's health, that goes multifold.
Thank you. And Bridget.
Thank you, Cindy, today. But one of the things I've learned is also looking at it from the anatomical lens. This is something that probably I've kind of not considered, because public health, we hardly talk about economics and anatomy, but it's also, but that's something that I think we need to incorporate moving forward as we develop products, especially some of the hardware that's important. So in our work. So I think another thing is to ensure that I continue being an active voice, making sure that emphasize the need to keep pushing and making sure that women get not just that place at the table, but they get to make that influence that is required to move the needle. Because I think we're almost getting to a point where we just tick off boxes, or there's a woman present, but what exactly is changing because she's present? So that's something that I'm taking away from this webinar today.
Thank you. This has been so insightful, and I appreciate your unique perspectives. And I just wanted to say to all the ladies out there, all the people out there, everybody out there, that navigate through your world in your own unique way, because it's only by doing that that we will truly affect change, because everything is changing. So when we talk about changing the world, every day that we're here, we're changing the world, because nothing is stagnant. I always talk about at the end of all these things that one day I was running after a friend at school around the corner, realized when I got up to her that it wasn't her. So I just kept running around the corner and waving and yelling her name, Hilda, Hilda, Hilda. So for everybody out there, if you feel a little bit lost and you get up against something and you realize, whoops, just keep running and waving, you'll find the other side of it. Thank you again, and have an amazing International Women's Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
It's a pleasure.
you. Yeah, thank you.